me turn the volume up a little bit too. Okay, so this session is obviously, as you can see on the screen, the first Thanksgiving myth, reconciling Thanksgiving Day for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. This is a session I'm a contractor through ERLC, but we're all under the ARPDC consortium, which is Alberta Regional Professional Development. And I'm going to show you their website as well, because there's so many amazing resources there that you can use. And we're also under jurisdiction of Learn Alberta, because we get our funding through them. Land acknowledgement, I always do one anyways before they asked us to. Tanse. I live on Treaty 7 land, which is the ancestral home of the Blackfoot people. I'm in Calgary. There's also Dene people and Métis Nation number 3 people here as well. And I also belong myself to the Manitoba Métis Federation. All have shaped Alberta and Canada, and if you want, you can put if you live on a treaty land or you're close to a settlement, or you know the culture of the people that lived there before they were removed, you can put that into the chat to do that. So we are called now with our presentations, Designers of Professional Learning, and I like that because I think it's pretty all-encompassing, because we do a variety of different things besides presentations, work on curriculum, and develop different resources and things like that throughout the year, and we all collaborate, which is really what's amazing now that we're all essentially, since COVID, being online for the most part. I do face-to-face and my colleagues do as well, but you know, we get to collaborate together now from all the different regions, which is great because we get to share that knowledge that we all have in different areas, because we know as teachers we all have different strengths that we can use, so it's always great. Okay, so see. Oh, Tracy says she's in Treaty 6, Métis Zone 4. Thank you. I am Red River Métis. My family is originally from what is known as the Red River Settlement, which I know is a legal term that occurred after the Red River Resistance, but I'm not going to get into that political quagmire there. My main family surnames, as we all identify each other as our European last names because we're mixed. Mowat, McDonald, Mackay, and Beaudry. My mom is a Mowat. So you can see most of my family is originally from Scotland, Scottish Métis. The Beaudrys are actually a Alberta family. They're a voyageur family from northern Alberta. And that picture there is that handsome gentleman is my great-grandfather, James Mowat. He worked at Lower Fort Garry later as a court magistrate. And there's a school in a park in Fort Saskatchewan named after him, James Mowat Elementary and Mowat Park. And there's a street in Edmonton named after him, James Mowat Trail. It's spelled with 2 T's. I always say no matter. The name was actually spelled M-O-A-D before coming to Canada, but the English didn't understand the Scottish accent apparently, so that's okay. The picture beside that, the middle boy there is my grandpa when he was a little boy. He was about 6 there as far as I could determine, so I'm guessing that picture is from around 1916. And then one of my great-grandfather, that would just be the turn of the century, of the 20th century, like late 19th century into the early 20th century. That's my grandpa Rosser and his 2 brothers, Stanley Oliver and my great-aunt Tassie. Yeah, so that's my background, is that I grew up in Manitoba, what is historically Métis area. I used to jokingly say that I'm probably related to everybody in town in Selkirk, and I did my ancestry and found out pretty much true. I'm either related by blood kinship or some kind of battle relationship or that sort of thing, or neighbors, so all knew each other. I started working in this area a long time ago when I lived in Winnipeg. I was one of the only Indigenous teachers in the school that I was in the North End, Winnipeg, where I actually went to school myself and graduated from Seven Oaks School Division, and I ended up teaching there. So as you can imagine, I hope there's many more Indigenous teachers now, but back then there weren't a lot of opportunities. I myself, I like a lot of us, I worked 3 jobs, that sort of thing, put myself through school, and didn't have a lot of help in that area either. But I think it was also a lot easier. I have to say, I didn't think it was that easy then, but to pay for school compared to now, that's for sure, how much things are costing. But that's kind of my background, and I've worked in developing Indigenous curriculum. I worked with Kataskanal Tribal Council last year. So, no, I guess it's almost 2 years ago now, January of 2021 until July, taking their outreach program, grades 7 to 9. I indigenized it for their particular culture and decolonized it, added land-based learning and Cree language. And that really just inspired me, and everybody was very happy with the work that I did. And so I was encouraged to continue doing that and to help other teachers to be able to do some of that work as well, and to guide you guys. I know especially non-Indigenous teachers in particular are very, pensive about being able to do this work correctly and to make sure that they're, not appropriating and they're not dishonoring or disrespecting, all that kind of stuff. And I appreciate that, right? So that's my kind of drive to do this portion of what I do for work, is to help teachers to be able to maneuver through that, because there's so much information out there now. When I first started doing work in this area like 20 years ago, it was terrible trying to find even books and things like that for classrooms, but now there's so much, and it's almost like, I had a teacher say that to me yesterday after presentation, it's almost too much and overwhelming. They don't know what they should use and what they shouldn't use. So hopefully I can help with that a bit. Yeah. So I do, like I said, I just want to show you the ARPDC website and resources. There's some really amazing stuff on there, especially for the First Nations, Métis, Inuit stuff. There's so many great resources. As you'll notice, Empowering the Spirit, right, is one that's right on there. You can go to that one, right, that has some amazing resources on there. As you can see across there, there's tons of stuff, including, down here, you can look at some where do you start, some pedagogy, sharing through story, that sort of thing. And then the search options at the top of the ARPDC website are really great too, because you can find resources by focus. Yesterday I did one on the TQS, so you could search by the TQS, and then there's featured websites as well, and then there's en français resources as well. So if I go to find resources by focus, I'm going to go to First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and it comes up with all of these things that are already developed. So, I always encourage people to take a look here. This, our tax dollars from, all the things that we've been doing over the years have gone into paying for this, yours and mine, and, everybody else out there. We should be using this stuff because there's some really great stuff that our teachers in Alberta have worked to create these. So yeah, it's always a good place to start. That's for sure. This is a super short video. It is from the US because the idea of Thanksgiving, I just want to go there first. I know we celebrate Thanksgiving in Canada, and there's a lot of, especially because the US is so prominent with this idea, and their myth. I'm going to say myth because if you don't know the true story, you'll find it out as we go along, of the US Thanksgiving. And this is 6 indigenous, or in the United States, we'd still just say Native or Indian, because that's their legal term as well, girls, and just talking about some of their thoughts, just to start you off on Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving, America. I'm Donna, and I'm here with my friends to tell you the real history behind this holiday. Growing up, I knew that what they told you in school about Thanksgiving wasn't true. That's not the true story. The true story behind Thanksgiving was, after every killing of a whole village, these European settlers celebrated it, and they called it Thanksgiving. But it wasn't until Abraham Lincoln became president that it became an official holiday. He ordered 38 Dakota men to be hung for war crimes after the sacred holiday Christmas. We take this time to remember our elders who lost their lives due to what really happened. Usually my mom makes a Native American dish for us, and we pray. Growing up, I would be kind of annoyed that I didn't know what actually happened on Thanksgiving, and that they're actually celebrating the deaths of many people and many tribes that were lost.
Whether it's to give thanks or to be with your family, you should learn how the holiday was established in the first place.
I'm thankful for being born indigenous to this continent.
I'm thankful that I still have my culture.
I'm thankful that my elders kept our culture alive all these years.
I'm thankful to be indigenous, resilient, and alive.
I'm thankful for us all to be able to stand together, stand strong, and stand as one.
Happy Thanksgiving, America.
Happy Thanksgiving,
up.
America.
Go past that. Yeah, so it's rather striking and poignant. And then obviously we're not Americans, you know, but we all live on Turtle Island, and the things that happened in the United States were vastly different in many different ways in terms of the approach. Obviously, we know, and there was an out and out approach to genocide of indigenous peoples that lived there. And I mean, that that happened across the world, right? That wasn't specific to here, but we live here, right? So, and we're teaching about here, so that's why we focus on the course, right? And you know, and the indigenous experience isn't unique in terms of other groups of people going after them. I mean, I have often said this. I said this the other day to somebody, a friend that's First Nations. I said, you know, my grandpa's family being Scottish, and they were Highlanders for the most part, before they came to Canada to work for the Hudson Bay Company, which was a British company. They had no choice because they had no other way to earn, you know, money at that point, because the English had taken everything from them. They had no land, it was taken. They had no animals to raise on it. That was done by the English government. They had their languages were taken away, Gaelic and Orcadian, which are revived again, just like as they're being revived here across, you know, Ireland and Scotland and Orkney and those places in Shetland. Those languages are being revived. You know, their colors were taken away. They weren't allowed to wear their kilts anymore. You know, and there was all kinds of atrocities that I don't want to get into, you know, but the burning of the land and hurting of people, etc., as you can only imagine. And then they came to Canada to work for this English company, and you know, as well, being called savages. The Scottish were called savages, the Highlanders particularly, by the English. And they came here and married indigenous women and started families here, became, you know, what became known as Métis, alongside their, and you know, like I said, there's some French in my family as well, mixed, right? Called savages again. Right? So I was kind of jokingly saying, and I know it doesn't sound funny to you guys, but when it's your own history, you can laugh about it a little bit. But I was like, we're like savages times two. So there you go. So maybe I should get a t-shirt made or something and explain it to people. But you know, you get the idea. Like it's not unique to here, but it, you know, people across the world have done horrible things to each other, including within their own groups of people too, right? But this isn't in fact the story. We call people that have come over and colonizers, right? Or settlers. My people were also settlers. They just happened to choose a different path to, you know, become involved with indigenous people that were already here and form our own culture. But we're talking about a particular group of people that come into another country that's already existing and has culture and language and history and all that stuff already, and assumes they're better than those other people and does what they like, right? That's kind of the story of the conquest that went on, you know, during the age of exploration in particular, that's most recent to us anyways, right? So talking about the truth about I'm always make sure I say this right, Wampanoag people and the Pilgrims. So, and I also have to tell you, on my father's side of the family, both my grandpa and grandmother have ties to that original land. They didn't come, well, they came shortly after the Mayflower, and they were related to a lot of those people. And so they were part of that. So I have a very strange connection with history, because I have this crazy, you know, Reformation Protestantism that was from the East Coast of the United States, so the original people, that white people that lived there, and literally white because my father's last name was White. And then eventually became, you know, loyalists that escaped to what became New Brunswick, what was Nova Scotia entirely at that time. And so I have both sides of it. My father, having married my mother, and knowing that my grandfather was very obviously indigenous by seeing him, although my mother's blonde because she looks like her Swedish grandfather, you know, he never had a problem with that. And that was never a thing in my family that was passed down. So I think perhaps going through that experience of coming to Canada after what happened to them as well, the United States maybe perhaps did a little bit of change in their attitude. But that attitude's pervasive, you know, throughout the United States, right? We talk about the racism and the things that exist. And I say, like, part of my people were there too. I blame it on a lot of the stuff that they did, because they weren't welcome in England. They were kicked out, as a matter of fact, by King James. So these were people that already came with a lot of issues, and they brought it to this land and they put it upon these other people that lived here. And so there's a lot of misconceptions about that original Thanksgiving. And like the girls were saying in that video, very poignantly, that people don't understand the US Thanksgiving and what actually happened, right? So here's some 4 facts anyway that I found in this article that really explain, I think, very well, right? So there's no evidence that the Wampanoag people were even invited in the first place to that Thanksgiving dinner. There just wasn't. There's an account that say about 90 members of them were present, but not by invitation. It seems like there was concern by the leader of the Wampanoag people that sent them out because they thought there was going to be a war, because these people were all gathering together from all these different places, because they weren't all in the same spot. People don't realize they were all coming together like a big feast. And for indigenous people, when that happens, when people are doing that from different areas and they're coming together, often it was to form a war tribe to go and attack somebody else that there was a problem, or a celebration. So you got to play it on the safe side, right, and make sure you know what they're going to do. And this happened to be the first for those people, a celebration. It's also their first encounter, right, that they have with these people. They're not making friends. Like, they have this idea, they got off the boat and they all like make friends, and it's years and years and years that going into this, right? They just walk in and they think they can just do whatever they want, as people do. And these pilgrims actually stole the tribe's winter provisions, right? They went in and took the food that these people had worked so hard off the land, whether it was meat that was dried or their vegetables that they had dried or whatever it might be, and they stole it, right? And then they also brought disease. We know that part, right? So there was a lot of issues that came up right away. And then the first harvest that the pilgrims had, there were lots of fights, because you can imagine they had stolen all their food originally. So what do you think the people that had their food stolen are going to try to do? They're going to get back what was stolen. It's gone, so they take their food that they've grown. So what happened was, writing back to Europe, and they needed people to help because, well, these natives were savages and they were attacking and they were going to kill them, and they were, threatened, their lives were threatened, and, they were scared, not telling anybody what they had been doing. And so they sent people over from England, and they seized the land, they imprisoned them, they enslaved them, and they were killing them. And so that's what the girls were talking about there, right? So all around this idea of Thanksgiving, there were marked brutalities that went on. Like you notice here, like there's the Pequot massacre of 1636. There's the beheading of the Wampanoag leader Metacom in 1676. So these are things that are always left out of, like, you get those cute children's stories and the little, cartoons that are on TV and stuff like that for kids in America for the first Thanksgiving, but they leave out all this stuff, right? That's really, like, that's the story of Thanksgiving there. Here in Canada, we're going to talk about the first European Thanksgiving first, because I'm going to explain to you guys how this has always been a part of Indigenous culture and still is, to always give thanks. And that was something Europeans actually got from the Indigenous people that were here. So the story is that the Thanksgiving that occurred in Canada actually occurred before the one in the United States. So 2 of them actually before the ones that happened in the United States. So in 1578, there was Martin Frobisher and his crew gave thanks and communion was observed. And this took place in what was called the Newfoundland, but now is present day Nunavut, right? And so what they dined on was salt beef, biscuits, mushy peas, and the usual British diet on a boat, right? And they gave thanks for communion. And that was considered the first Canadian Thanksgiving, which I would say the first European Canadian Thanksgiving. And then 48 years later, November 14, 1606, people that had been living in New France, there was Samuel de Champlain. He had a huge feast of Thanksgiving, and this is where we see the influence now of the Indigenous cultures, because the Mi'kmaq and the French worked together. And the Mi'kmaq, if you know anything about the battles that occurred against the United States, even later, going into the War of 1812, the Mi'kmaq worked together with the French, particularly, and even the British at times, all along that coast to help keep the Americans out. And so they were a great help to the people that lived there that were of European descent. And so a lot of the things that we celebrate in Canada, like for instance, the idea of cranberries, right? That comes from the Mi'kmaq. They showed them how to take them and, dry them and whatever, and then they made them into sauces and things like that, as the French do, because, French love to have sauces and things like that on everything, right? So they put their own little spin on it. And then, of course they called them petit pomme rouge, right? Interesting. But so we get a lot of these traditions, right? So I'm going to explain that a little bit about too as well. This is a video, and I know this lady looks scary. I'm sorry, the where it stops in the thumbnail here, she looks rather harsh, but I think it's just the way her glasses are positioned with her camera, the entire thing. I apologize for that, but it is an excellent video. It's quite short and succinct to explain to you. So what I want to talk about too is the idea of discovering this land, right? So discovering this land. This land was always here, and people have lived here. Indigenous people, as far as they're concerned, First Nations people, they believe they've lived here all this time, like forever. We have archaeological evidence going back at least 15,000 years at this point, and it keeps going back farther and farther every time they make discoveries. So there was no discovering this island, this huge, massive land. It was coming upon a land that already had history and had people living here for thousands and thousands of years. So I just want to debunk that too, as right, because it always annoys me when people say they discovered, North America. I'm like, no, it was already here and there were already people. You came and did what you wanted to, right? Like as people do. So I just goes over a little bit more about kind of the Indigenous Canadian perspective, and the myth of that land was discovered here, and kind of that idea that lends itself to Thanksgiving. A lot of the time people say, is kind of attached to that idea as well.
Thanksgiving is a tradition during which Canadians gather to eat and count their blessings. Some say it's time to rethink how it's celebrated given its colonial history. Jacqueline Romanov is an associate professor in Indigenous Studies at the University of Winnipeg and joins us. Professor Romanov, good to have you on the program. I know you don't speak necessarily on behalf of all Indigenous people, but perhaps you could walk us through the discomfort that you understand some Indigenous people have on this day.
I mean, I think it's fairly common, certainly with a lot of younger people. I mean, when you look at what Thanksgiving is celebrating and the sort of typical story of the symbols that were given, about early settlers having this, almost mythical dinner on this land, this first dinner to sort of celebrate the harvest. Basically, it shows a very non-Indigenous view, I guess you could say, of what was happening. Mm-hmm. It makes the early sort of early colonialism look very peaceful, and almost like Indigenous people kind of voluntarily handed over the land and resources over to the new arrivals, which is generally quite a whitewashing of what history was actually about for Indigenous people.
Because it ignored the violence.
Yeah, basically, right? Early colonialism was about forced displacement. It was about violence. It was about, we're in the middle of a pandemic now. Indigenous people faced all kinds of disease that wiped out, some say up to a third of the population, if not more at the time. So it was really quite a traumatic time in history where there was a lot of suffering, misery. Nowadays we're talking more about in terms of genocide, in terms of how Indigenous people experience that history. So it's not something we're particularly, likely to be thankful for.
You have talked about sort of the way in which it might now be framed or perhaps reclaimed by the Indigenous community. And this is in the context that long before there was a Canada, there was some version of a harvest feast in advance of winter setting in, but after the crops and things that had been grown for sustenance were made available to a larger community. What is the sense that you have about how this might be claimed or framed today to recognize that pre-Canada Indigenous history?
Right. Well, I mean, I think there are a lot of Indigenous people that do this, right? That sort of define themselves in terms of their culture, not just in opposition to colonial Canada, right? Indigenous culture, although there's certainly many different ones across Canada, but many of them would share basic principles like this idea of relationships with all my relations across the land. Now that would include the soil, the rocks, the land, the trees, right? Everything in the ecosystem that we have as our relations, and that, we exist because of our relationship. So the gratitude for everything that the earth has given us to survive for that year, gratitude for having those that we love around us, gratitude really, and renewal, I guess, of thanks again for a new cycle to be starting again. So those are sort of traditional Indigenous values that would be born, in and around a time like this, prior to the arrival of the Europeans.
So, I mean, just sort of going back to this notion, what are things that can be within the diversity of Canada's Indigenous peoples? What perhaps might be done in a concrete way on this day to recognize those long-standing traditions?
Well, I mean, it would be nice. I noticed over our neighbors to the South United States called, have today, what used to be Columbus Day, now they recognize it's Indigenous Peoples Day.
Mm-hmm.
And so for Canadians, sure, they should be thankful and thankful for a lot of things. But one of the things that they should be thankful for is for having, our democracy, this great life, all the land and natural resources, really, that was Indigenous land and resources. And that, in cases across Canada, Indigenous people, in stories, all across this country, we hear stories of how Indigenous people really reached out and helped the new settlers in this country, how to adapt to the ecosystem, how to learn to hunt and fish in this type of setting. And help set up, the early economy was the fur trade economy, which was again built on Indigenous labor. And then the next, we had the agriculture economy, which was built on Indigenous land. So non-Indigenous Canadians have a lot to be thankful for to Indigenous people.
Because Canada has such diversity and welcomes hundreds of thousands of newcomers every single year, how do you address the nuance of the traditions and experiences that they may have from their home countries, the traditions that they're now learning coming to Canada? How do you strike that nuance in the context of today?
Well, everybody is going to be coming with their own culture and their own stories for sure. But here they are coming to Canada, a country that we would like to believe embraces newcomers, but that history comes from Indigenous people, right? And I think that everyone, regardless if they're arriving on this land today, or whether they arrived, their ancestors arrived 200 years ago, there still is that should be that understanding that Canada inherently, I guess you could say, as one of the founding nations of this country, owes a debt to its Indigenous people.
Professor Romanov, thank you so much for chatting with us today. I certainly appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm just gonna skip through this because it's
Thanks,
gonna go again. Yeah, there we go. Sorry, this. Yeah, so again, like when I do presentations, I don't do them to create guilt in anyone. I'm just trying to give you the facts, right? This is what happened. And so I think always looking forward, to me, it's always about looking what can we do in a positive direction. So we can focus on all the bad things that happened in the past, but we cannot change those things. What we're going forward as educators, we can change those perceptions of those fallacies, right? We can correct those myths. We can make sure that we're educating the children and the parents as to the truth, right? And of course, we have to present it in a way that is age appropriate. I always say that, right? We're not going to tell small children, that people are beheaded and enslaved and all this stuff, right? Because it's not appropriate, and it's going to, and plus we also have to always remember, there's kids in our classrooms that have trauma, not just Indigenous children, right? There's kids that have gone through all kinds of things and have all different backgrounds. They could be coming from other countries where they're refugees and they've experienced bad things. There's kids who have grown up with violence of all different kinds of sorts towards themselves, or domestic violence towards, family members. And, or depending on where they live in the neighborhood they live in, they could also experience it there. So we always have to be careful of that. We always need to know our audience. We always need to know the children that we're working with. So I always say that. I don't think it's necessary to, create fear and pain in people, but I also don't think we should be lying to them and making them think that this was just such a wonderful thing, that all that it happened, right? This mythical story. So I think there's a different way to approach it, right? And I think here's some good ways, right? So food appropriation has happened. Like I said, a lot of the things that were learned in Canada in particular, and states too, about food that we use in particular around Thanksgiving and things like that, are indigenous foods. So I think that would be one way to go about it, right? Teach the kids. This is where a lot of these foods come from, right? Like that lady the professor was saying, talking about the lands that your people are farming on, like, or that we get our food from. It's indigenous land that we're getting it from. So we should be thankful that the indigenous people, not that they gave it, but well, some of it they wanted to share, but you know what happened. Or the fact that indigenous peoples helped the Europeans that came here. My family, being Métis, learned everything from our indigenous women and the men that were there, right? Like, I always, when I go to ceremony, things like that, I always say thanks to my ancestors. I'm not just talking about my indigenous ancestors, all of them, but like she said, we always talk about all my relations, which includes everything. But when I talk about my family relations and my ancestors, I always think of those women, because I think, to me, I like terrifying. You're a young woman, usually, or probably maybe 13 or 14 years old, or maybe 15 if you're lucky, and you got this man who looks and smells and has hair and like totally different color, and you're like, what's happening here? And you're possibly married off to him without being asked sometimes, right? Because that's how life worked back then. You might be traded for a blanket and a musket, who knows, or depending on the situation and where you're living. And and here you are, you have to educate this man on how to survive on this land. You have to show him everything, right? So I have great respect for those women in my family that that came and into those situations, and I think how strong and brave they were to go through that. And then the children that they produced, that knew then from both cultures what to do and could help, and then traded and lived with their cousins that were indigenous, and worked with them all the time, right? So there's all of that stuff that people forget that went on and occurred, that we just didn't all of a sudden land here and everything was like great, right? So but we can do that, right? We can talk about that, right? Like in this one, there's an article I've got a link to in CBC News as well, and he's a chef, Muskego chef from Attawapiskat First Nation, which we've all heard lots of stuff about there, which bad things have happened, but this is a good thing, right? He's from there, and he talks about, you've got squash, there were tubers, potatoes, mashed potatoes, turkey, corn, all that stuff was here. All that stuff was grown and harvested by indigenous peoples. The turkeys, that kind of stuff were, in the East, of course, the particular ones that we would use more for Thanksgiving dinners. There was other birds out here, the large birds, especially like goose and stuff like that. Or we would kill a goose or eat lots of mini geese. And taught everybody about the changing of the seasons. But indigenous people have always given thanks for all those seasons, on the change of the seasons, the solstice, or the equinoxes and things like that, and living by the moon. So sorry, there's something in the chat here. Oh, you're welcome. So yeah, so like there's all this stuff that's going on. So I think that's one thing you could share with kids, right? You could even make up a menu for Thanksgiving and talk about that, and talk about where did these foods come from? How did these people know when they came here, the Europeans, where did they get it? Well, you could go into a little bit of that history, right? You could talk about that. That's a positive thing. I do want to incorporate, as I talk about some of the ceremonial type stuff, in terms of Thanksgiving, right? And learning this. Indigenous people have always, in traditional practices, and I say that because many people have been colonized. My grandfather was Anglican, and I wasn't allowed to learn any Indigenous practices. That's something I've taken up on my own. Fortunately, I've met people that have, graciously guided me and brought me into ceremony and things like that. So, I've learned many of these things now. But and I'm at home, we always gave thanks. We prayed before meals and that sort of thing too, right? But it's a different kind of thanks when it's an Indigenous thanks, when you're doing it in ceremony or not, even if it's individual. You're thanking the animal, if you're eating meat, you're thanking the plants, you're thanking the earth, the soil, like she was saying, like everything that's around, thanking creation for giving you these things, right? All my relations are all of the things that are around me because I can't exist without them, right? I'm in relation to everything in that constant circle. If you go to an actual ceremonial meal, a blessing or a prayer is said by an elder or knowledge keeper. Any meal, honestly, but ceremonials especially. A spirit plate, and I don't know if anybody knows what this is, and I can explain a little bit, is prepared at every ceremony meal for ancestors. So when you have a ceremony, you invite the ancestors to come in. So all of your grandfathers, grandmothers, all the generations to come in to sit with you, because we believe they're always with us, but they come in to sit with us, and we prepare a spirit plate. And so a little bit of everything that's on the table everywhere and that exists, that's in the room, the food is put onto a plate to put out in honor of the ancestors, and then it's even taken outside and left out for nature to consume, but it's in honor of the ancestors that are there. And then that gathering together to share meals is integral. I mean, COVID was horrible for everybody, I know, but particularly indigenous communities, it was so hard. Everything is about relation and those kinship ties and those friendships and things like that. And it was very painful for people, probably more than a lot of, like, we live in these nuclear communities or live on our own and that sort of thing. And but it was really hard. Elders are also brought their meals first by men in the group usually. And I say this usually because not every culture does this. I know here in Calgary in particular, that's the way it's done. Most of the people that I know, like there's Stoney, Nakota, Blackfoot people that I've gone to ceremony with all at one time. And it was always the men that did it. I ended up doing it one time just because nobody was getting it done. It was a big mass confusion, but I ended up doing it. I know I wasn't supposed to, but I did. They were just glad because they got their food. But they're supposed to be fed before us. So the elders are honored and fed always before us, and you get them a plate of food, and so they don't have to get up and do it themselves. You bring it to them and ask them if there's anything else that they need. And then there's, again, like I said, specific practices differ by cultural indigenous groups. And, for instance, even I go to Sweat Lodge, I was there on Sunday. I've gone to different ones that are performed differently. It depends on the person who's doing it, but the intention is always the same. And there's always 4 rounds for the 4 directions, et cetera, right? So, but there may be slight differences in how people do things, and you just go with the flow and you watch what everybody else does, basically. And that's what I always tell people. I think I did also put this in. I think learning about the truth about Thanksgiving really is that idea of bringing things into reconciliation, right? And I always think I hate it when people just pay lip service to a word, right? We get these buzzwords, and reconciliation is one of them. And eventually it'll turn into something else because the meaning will, transmute into a different area or whatever it might be. But and I'm not going to belabor this point, but just looking at that idea of Canadians understanding in general, right? That dark history. So this does give some actual more specific details for Canada, right? In terms of the things that happened here, and I do sessions on the residential schools and then on the Indian Act and that sort of thing. But the Indian Act itself, brought in by John A. Macdonald, was to kill the Indian in the child, right? And that taking away the land, taking away the languages, like I said, that what happened to my grandpa's family in Scotland first, right? And then they did the same thing here, followed suit with the indigenous peoples here. And you take away the spirit of the people, right? Initially, you take away the spirit of the people, but indigenous people have shown that they're very resilient, and it's the fastest growing population in Canada right now is indigenous peoples, and the languages are being revitalized. So there's so many good things that are happening. So I like to always point that out. It's not all doom and gloom for what has happened. People now know about what happened at residential schools, like the rest of us have always known these things have happened, but now you guys know, if you're non-indigenous, that this has happened. So how do we take that dark history, right? How do we take that idea that all of these things led to the residential schools and the deaths and abuse of innocent children by people who are supposed to be caring in these churches and things like that, and fully supported by the government, right? How do we do that? I think that acknowledging these things and trying to put not a spin on it, right? Not a spin, because we're not spinning it. We're taking it and we're trying to find what we can out of here to make it good, right? So always knowing that all of these things work hand in hand, part and parcel together to have done that. But we want to work together towards that reconciliation of Indigenous peoples in Canada with the people who are living here. Because nobody who's Indigenous is saying, well, there are people, I guess, that are pretty militant. They're hurt. They're hurt people. And as you know, the expression hurt people, right? And I know people who are militant and they're angry and they're hurt at the things that have happened. And they have to go through healing to fix that. And maybe one of the ways we can help them is to do some of these things, right? To acknowledge what has happened. You know, and so I've some ideas for you guys in here too. There's some books that you can share in your classrooms for various age groups as well. This is a really good website that I found, and it had a lot of the books I was researching anyway that I found, and I just thought this has a little bit of a write-up on each one, so you could on this link look at it. And I do have, like, I'll show you in Good Minds. There's Strong Nations is a great bookstore online. I've used Good Minds because I like the way that they sort things for teachers. I'll show you that with one of the links so you can see that, just because it's by grade level and subject and that sort of thing. But yeah, it's like like I said, some of these focus on the United States. And I remember when I was a kid, we learned about the US Thanksgiving when I was in school. I'm old. I always thought Thanksgiving was just an American thing, quite honestly, because that's how I was taught. We even made like pilgrim hats and like, we even talked about the Mayflower and stuff like that. I remember learning that. It was crazy that we did that. But anyways, so there's just examples of some books on here. This is actually one that I don't know if I don't think that person's here today. Maybe they are. But somebody emailed me about this book this week and asked about it, and I did find a description on here. And this is obviously the American point of view, 1621, talking about that first Thanksgiving. And it really is with National Geographic has beautiful pictures and things like that, and it's really great, I think, for the older kids. It's got a lot of great visuals and things like that in it. So if you're looking at even junior high school, even for those kids that are maybe on the lower levels of reading and that sort of thing, and that you couldn't use some of those videos for. But yeah, like I don't promote coloring books, but there might be some things you could use in there as visuals. And then some things that are positive, right? So there's We Are Grateful. And this gets into, it talks about it's a Cherokee Nation, but sorry, but it's this website, it's not letting me. There we go. But it does talk about their influence and what they gave to the people that were there, traditional values, right? And the good morning message. And so anyways, there's some books on there that you can look at. And like this is scrolling really slowly, so I don't want to waste a lot of time on there because you can look at the books that are on there. But like I said, I do have links to some of these. So I just wanted to show you. And I tried to use a variety of different Indigenous groups as well. Hopefully that will give you, a few options. So like I said, Good Minds. If you haven't been to this website, I really like it. Like I said, I always try to buy from Indigenous owned businesses myself, wherever possible, especially when getting Indigenous products, because first of all, they should have vetted them. And then we know that it's going back into our community. So you can either go just buy books there. They've got a whole list of different ways to do it. Children, you can look at leveled readers, the different subjects, like I said, traditional knowledge. Teens, same thing, you can get into the different areas. And then if you go for educators, there's a whole list of things, different pedagogical and information wise for you, and then other resources. And so yeah, I like the way it's laid out. It's really great for finding things. So this is for the youngins. So this is preschool, kindergarten, grade 1, but it's a really sweet book and it's really beautifully illustrated too, right? So it's talking about how did I say? I can never say it properly. Haudenosaunee. It's a hard word for me. Anyways, I'm learning Cree, not that language. So, but it is a really cute book. So there's that one on Thanksgiving. There is the Thanksgiving address, which is like the prayer and that sort of thing, giving thanks. Another one. I did include Métis one in here as well, because I know some of you also live close to Métis settlements or may have a lot of Métis children in your classrooms in the cities, particularly. And this is illustrated by Leah Dorian, she's my favorite Métis artist and author. So, and this is also for young ones, but as you go down, you also see there's a whole list of different books that are, if you're looking for stuff for Métis as well, which of course I'm always going to promote. Yeah. So there are mostly the young ones on here for this, but I mean, the older kids, you can show them videos and you can talk to them about some of these issues, right? We want to promote a positive view, at least when the kids are young, of Indigenous peoples and their contribution and to the country, and that Thanksgiving is in fact, you know, like when we talk about the three sisters, this is what this story is about, right? So corn, squash, my brain just went completely beans. I knew that growing up, even I'm like, oh, my brain just went dead there for a moment. But you know, it's the story of the three sisters, and so that's always a good one too to have kids learn. And then I'm going to show you a few resources. Just so that you guys have a copy. This is a YouTube one, and it is a cartoon, but it is ish a cartoon. It's more for getting into those older grades or even into junior high, but done in a cartoonish format, right? So it's a little bit more palatable for some of them. But it's some quasi documentary, and I'm not going to show you the whole video. I just don't have time to do that. But let's see. It's by Uncivil History. If you know this website, it's got some really good stuff. They basically debunk things in history. But it, as you can tell, it kind of does it like a newsreel-ish type voice. And he talks about the first one in the United States. So you could obviously talk about what happened in Canada, but then refer to, you know, the ideas in the States about this being this lovely, wonderful coming together of people. That didn't happen. The ATA has some really great resources for you guys as well on Thanksgiving specifically. And they do, like I said, they that's on there again. I'm not going to try to say the name again because I'm going to butcher it and I don't want to do that. The Thanksgiving address again. You know, looking at that complicated history in Indigenous communities and that sort of thing. So that would be really good for the older kids. I know I taught grade 9 social studies, so that would really go well with it too. You know, and then I wanted to include some ideas here too as well, some perspectives from Indigenous people in Canada in regard to Thanksgiving. And I have to say, I mean, most people that I know that are First Nations, Métis, Inuit, like especially Métis people, like Thanksgiving's a big thing, right? Because it goes along with the Christmas dinners and Easter dinners and all that kind of stuff. We're very colonized, right? Very colonized people in general, unless you live on a settlement. But I know for myself, even this last year, everybody was doing different things that day anyways. My daughter was in Edmonton with her boyfriend's family, and my son and his wife, well, now wife, were going to her parents. And quite honestly, they know that I'm not really keen on it myself. And so I just said, well, that's okay. Well, you guys go do your thing and I'll be fine. I'll do my own thing. And they just, you know, left me to my own devices. If they wanted to have a dinner, I would certainly make them a dinner, that's for sure. But yeah, again, it's not really a big holiday for me, but I'm also not big on the regular holidays myself because I don't celebrate those things anymore either. So kind of goes part and parcel. But this has some ideas, like just some different points of view, right? So you could also share these with the students, right? Different points of view on Thanksgiving, you know, and some people, like I said, are starting to call it your welcome weekend, right? So you can say, you know, instead of Thanksgiving, it's saying you're welcome to the First Nations people that, you know, and Inuit people that have always lived here, you know, about that weekend and their contributions. So that could be something. Another one too, Time Magazine. I thought this is, you know, American perspective, but again, Native American. Really focusing too on the food that was given there and talking about, you know, like the ideas, like I know like the cookbooks that came out, right? I remember my Nana had the 60s Betty Crocker cookbook and all that kind of stuff, and all of those recipes in there that, you know, were those 1950s and 60s things, like I said, like the deviled eggs and all that kind of stuff. And we always had pickles and things like that, but then you also had the cranberry sauce and you had the turkey and you had the corn and you had the potatoes and all those things, right? And I know my grandpa always knew that because he always said that, you know, well, corn is from here, it's always been here. Right? And but not everybody knows that, right? So there's just a bit more of information on there, and the Time Magazine is a really good article. And I have time to show you the last one. So, and this is the CNN story, and I think this is obviously more the high school level, even grade 9 and above could handle this. But, you know, talking about that, you know, the genocide that has occurred at the hands of the First settlers that came here to the United States and what did occur. So, you know, that myth of what has happened. And, you know, there's a plaque there now for the National Day of Mourning set in the town of Plymouth, which I think is a big step in the right direction, right? Putting up a statue this time and a monument to acknowledge what had happened, right? So, and it does give you a bit more of that story, and you can still tell you know, the kids about this. And I don't know if anybody watches Parks and Recreation, but they do have a whole running kind of, it's done as a gag, but you know, in a very like kind of way, we're like, oof, this is terrible, right? In their town hall and in Parks and Recs is this whole story about the Native Americans that were slaughtered there, and it is really based on this story of the Wampanoag people. So if you ever watch that show, you could take clips of that and show kids in school. I think, like, you know, in that grade 9 and above group, you know, they're actually taking that story and putting it into a context, right? About how it's just readily accepted, because there's like paintings all over their town hall of you know, what had happened to these people as if it was no big deal. And they always talk about like, well, has anybody ever complained about that? And they're like, oh yes, all the time. We get several complaints, right? You know, and every time I see it, I'm just like, wow, you know, Amy Poehler is very funny. Anyways. Yeah, so questions and comments. I'm going to take the recording off now, you guys. Stop that.